January 1993, the National Gallery, London, and the room containing German pictures of the 16th century, including works by the portrait painter Hans Holbein the Younger. But the most famous Holbein of all is missing. It has been removed for cleaning and restoration. The Ambassadors is a great masterpiece of the Renaissance. Painted in England in 1533, it is one of the National Gallery's most popular pictures. The painting has been in the gallery since 1890. For the next 3 years, the public will have to make do with reproductions. But some people are afraid that the conservation process might cause the picture harm.
It's dangerous. These are very, very dangerous, disruptive, and in my view, often extremely damaging treatments. And the loss is to art.
I'm afraid it's going to be about 2 or 3 years before we see it back again, I'm afraid.
There's no chance of seeing it?
Not now, no.
They work like pathologists with corpses on a slab, and they strip away to find out what really should be there, and in the stripping take away the flesh.
Conservators have frequently been criticised. In recent years, controversy has sprung up around restorations in Italy, especially of the Sistine Chapel and Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And London's National Gallery has a long history of arguments about cleaning and restoration. The most common charge is to do with over-cleaning, producing old pictures that no longer look old. The colours are too bright. The gallery has in the past been accused of ignoring its critics, but the director, Neil MacGregor, has taken the unprecedented step of inviting the BBC to follow stage by stage the conservation work on the Ambassadors.
The picture belongs to the public. The National Gallery's pictures are the public's pictures, and I think the public have a right to see what we do to them. It's a picture that has suffered very much by becoming so dirty. So we wanted to improve the appearance of the picture, and above all to keep it safe for the next couple of centuries. And it's usually fairly clear what has gone wrong with the picture. If you look, for instance, at this picture by Girolamo dai Libri, painted sometime around 1510, the Virgin, the Christ Child, and St. Anne, you can see, I think, that not only is there a very dirty varnish, the clouds are quite dark grey, the whole thing is under a dirty veil that you can all see. But you can also, I think, notice that the paint itself has suffered damage. Someone's tried to repair it, the repairs have discoloured, and it's not what the artist intended. Now, it may be that we can't recover that. It may be that the paint has gone forever, and there's not much we can do. But on the whole, we believe that our duty is to try to present to the public, as much as we can, what the artist intended them to see.
Working out what an artist intended is extremely difficult. It requires taste, judgment, scientific analysis, and a fair amount of guesswork. It also requires scholarship. Susan Foister is curator in charge of the Ambassadors, both overseeing and supporting the conservation project.
The two men in the picture are, on the left, Jean de Dinteville, and on the right, the Bishop, Georges de Selve. Jean de Dinteville was ambassador to England in 1533. He spent most of the year over here waiting for the coronation of Anne Boleyn and then the birth of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII's child. But the month before the coronation of Anne Boleyn, in April 1533, his friend, the Bishop of Lavaur, Georges de Selve, came over to England, and this was obviously when the painting was commissioned. This is the most elaborate portrait that Holbein ever painted, certainly of somebody who wasn't a royal sitter. And there are more objects in this portrait than in any other by Holbein. And probably all the books and all the astronomical instruments are there because of their own personal interests. One of the mysteries of the picture was, for a long time, the skull in the lower part of the painting. And this works by what's called anamorphosis, which means that it's been distorted sideways. And probably one of the easiest ways of seeing it undistorted is by standing at right angles to the picture to one side, and the distortion does largely correct itself. The skull's a symbol of mortality, and in this period, many people had their portraits painted with their hand on a skull, or sometimes with the skull on the back of the picture, so that they or others could think about what would become of them in the end. And this is really a very clever alternative way of incorporating a skull in a picture. Rather than hiding it on the back of the picture, Holbein's concealed it on the front of the picture.
Martin Wilde is one of the world's most experienced and respected restorers. He's been at the National Gallery for 3 decades. Wilde is the gallery's chief conservator and the man who will be spending 3.5 years in the company of the ambassadors. He's facing a picture which was last cleaned, restored and varnished in the 1890s. Holbein painted the picture on 10 oak panels, and when it first came to the gallery, the joins between the panels were separating and needed to be filled. Martin Wilde is now some months into his cleaning. The filled splits are being exposed, and there is dramatic evidence of the distorting effects of the aged and dirty varnish.
The reason that we want to clean it again is that it was varnished very, very thickly, far more thickly than we would ever varnish a picture now. And the varnish has become not only extremely discoloured in the sense of being a sort of yellow-brown, but very foggy, so that it's very, very hard to see what is actually painted there by Holbein. The lower part of this globe is cleaned, and the effect of the varnish there is simply to make the blue into green. It doesn't actually make much difference to the green hanging in the background of the picture. It changes colours very unevenly. But you can see a considerable difference, I think, between the cleaned red sleeve and the other 2 parts of the red shirt, which are still dirty. But I think the most serious effect of the varnish is to almost completely obscure what's going on in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture. For one thing, Holbein has signed the picture down here at the back of the floor, and in the little bit that has been cleaned, one can see the beginning of the letters, Johannes Holbein, Pinje Bat, 1533, but where it's not cleaned, it's actually now invisible, whereas 30-odd years ago, one could make it out. And I think most seriously, the loot case, which is lying on the floor underneath the bottom shelf of this whatnot table, has become almost invisible. The back of the loot case, which accommodates the keyboard, is sticking up between Danteville's legs, and the front of it comes round here. I've cleaned just up to here, and you can see that there is a black thing sitting on the tiles of the floor. Over here, all that can be seen is a tremendously thick and foggy varnish, and the outline, obviously against the floor, is practically obscured now, which is rather a pity, because the varnish has a very flattening effect on the space which Holbein has very carefully designed into the picture with this geometric floor, partly copied from a floor at Westminster Abbey.
It will take a whole year, around 1,500 hours, to clean the painting. But before a restorer actually touches a picture, a number of records and investigations are made. First, there is photography in different kinds of light, in colour, and in black and white. X-rays reveal what lies beneath the surface of the painting, including lost paint, areas of past restoration, and the structure of the backing to the picture. The 2 other Holbeins owned by the National Gallery have both been cleaned and restored. Here, the lady with a squirrel and a starling is looked at under infrared. It's possible to see the original drawing underneath the paint and follow where the artist changed his mind as he went along. Ashok Roy is the gallery's scientific advisor. He takes minute samples from the painting to analyse the paint layers. The sample is the size of a pinpoint, only taken from areas already damaged. The main purpose of all these studies is to work out what is Holbein's original paint and what is paint applied by previous restorers.
One of the most important roles that I see the scientific department having is being able to inform our curatorial colleagues and our colleagues in conservation what pictures are made of, because we're used to looking at paintings ourselves with the naked eye and through the microscope. We have also developed some experience in judging condition of paint, how it's likely to behave, how it has behaved in the past, and what its structure is.
Take a sample from the carpet between the two ambassadors. The first layer is mostly chalk. The next is a light grey oil paint. Both of these cover the whole surface of the picture. The third layer is a thin black underpaint, and on top of that is the red which we see in the carpet, a vermilion. But since Holbein painted the picture, there have been further layers of paint added by previous restorers. Here, Ashok Roy investigates a sample taken from the floor underneath the curtain.
So this is the layer that I was suspicious of.
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is very clearly overpaint here, and you can see, in fact, there's a layer of old varnish, and you can see it goes into a crack here. And then there are two layers, apparently, of overpaint, later paint, on top. There's a lower khaki-ish colour and a hotter, more red-brown paint on top of that. And it seems to me there's just a bit of varnish between the two here. So these represent two stages of repainting that area.
No.
If you were to remove this, there's original paint underneath, of course, and
Yeah.
it looks in perfectly good condition.
Yes, these layers are rather hotter and slightly lighter and a good deal denser. A different texture to Holbein's paint.
There is also chemical analysis of components of the paint. A number of machines, like this scanning electron microscope, are used to isolate and identify pigments. Here, a restorer's blue, a Prussian blue, is distinguished from Holbein's blue, an azurite found in the pattern of the carpet. Then there is the question of whether colours have to any extent changed over the centuries. One area under scrutiny is D'Anteville's sleeve, which is painted in crimson lake, otherwise known as lac.
Lac is quite interesting. It's extracted from a species of scale insect found on the Indian subcontinent. And as you see, what it's done is it's parasitic on various species of tree, and it secretes an enormous quantity of this resin-like material. And the tree is absolutely encrusted with this stuff. And this was then broken off, and it was imported in this form into Europe. It's very easily extracted into water or alkali, and the net result is this rather wonderful crimson pigment here.
You're mixing that with linseed.
I'm mixing this with linseed oil, yes. And of course, Holbein would have done the same. So we do know that the shirt was a bluish pink. And we also know that it's very similar to this bluish pink that would have been used to dye a silk of that particular quality. In fact, that particular lake is in really remarkably good condition. In some cases, they have faded to a really very unpleasant greyish colour.
So do you think that the whole painting is pretty close to the way it would have been?
I think this is the only colour that would have changed to any extent and would thus alter the appearance of the picture. I think probably the colours as you see them are more or less the colour that it would have been.
The cleaned colours, that is. D'Anteville's right sleeve is still covered in dirty varnish. In contrast to the high technology of the laboratory, the method and materials used to clean the picture are fairly straightforward. Cotton wool swabs dipped in solvent and applied extremely lightly. It's a slow and painstaking process.
What's coming off on the swab is just this 100-year-old varnish, which has gone very yellow and which has got quite a lot of dirt from the atmosphere embedded in it, so it's sort of greyish yellow. Quite a few small holes in this area, which I'm just uncovering now. There's a little scratch or something here, and a round hole where the top layer of paint's flaked off, and then just down here there's a sort of arrow-shaped thing here, which actually goes down to the cleft between the fingers. And you can see quite clearly now there's a slight change in the position of the edge of the shirt. The pink shirt was originally about 4 millimeters lower. You can see the pink, which is showing through the white cuff just along here. It's very easy with this picture to distinguish what's Holbein's paint and what are the various generations of restoration. And the main thing is Holbein's paint is very beautifully and neatly applied, and the restoration is very sloppy and is far more soluble.
Susan Foister has encountered a historical problem area in the ambassadors. The medallion worn by Danteville, a medallion of St. Michael, a badge of honour in France at the time, is not Holbein's original.
I've just been sent these photographs of drawings from Basel, which seem to show Holbein's original drawings for the medallion with St. Michael. And this is probably the design for the medallion that Jean de Dinteville would have been wearing in the picture. The one that we're seeing here now is something that was painted in later on. We're not quite sure when, possibly quite early. But you can see in the X-ray that the original paint stops here, and this dark area is all damage, and then floating in the middle here is the present medallion, so that we can tell that was painted in after the rest of the picture was done. And in fact, you can see very well in the drawings that these figures are fantastically dynamic. They're turning and being looked at from different angles, whereas this figure here is very, very static. It's just standing on the dragon, pointing the spear down at him. So the original St. Michael would have been a much more interesting figure, much, much more lively than what we're seeing here today.
I think he's got the colour and tone of the medallion fairly accurately. I mean, it doesn't have anything like the crispness and sophistication of technique of Holbein's chain. And I think you can see that the last two links are rather less convincing than Holbein's links above. And you can see exactly how it's knotted before the two sides of it are joined together to support the medallion. That's looking at it in great detail, but at the same time, the restorer is always stepping back to see what the effect is from normal viewing distance and from further away than that, how it would look from across the gallery. And I think we'll probably keep it. Right.
Well, the medallion's actually only one of several areas in the picture which present this sort of problem. The greatest of these, of course, is the area of the skull, which has been very much overpainted and damaged, and we're going to have to think a lot about what we do there. And then there are some other slightly smaller areas. There's the handle of the globe, which is all repaint. And then underneath Jean de Dinteville's arm, on the left-hand side of the carpet, there's another slightly problematic area. So we have to decide really in each case what we do with those areas.
There are also a few parts of the painting where restoration has covered up Holbein's paint, which can now be uncovered. Martin Wilde is about to find out how much he can expose of the original paint in the book on the lower shelf. There are several layers here of overpaint and putty, which need to be delicately removed with a scalpel.
I'm just looking at the join in the panel where it runs down the end of the hymn book. The end of the notation certainly covered, and certainly the lines on which the notation sits. And if I start scraping off the restoration. We should find that. I'll start scraping the later cracked layer off just to thin it down, and wash away the debris, and you can begin to see the ruled lines on the page appearing.
Aren't you terrified of taking those with you?
Yes, I am. That's why I'm doing it very carefully. And this darker stuff underneath is probably the remains of an older varnish, or the very earliest bit of restoration.
So there's more than one layer?
Yes, it looks, there may be 4, there's certainly 3 in this area. And each one becomes bigger than the last, because it has to cover the previous restoration, which is discoloured, which ends up, of course, covering more and more of the picture, and distorting it further as the restoration discolours. The loss of paint is only about 1/4 of an inch wide here, but the restoration had ended up about 2 inches wide, because one had been put on top of the other without the picture being cleaned between restorations, as it were.
There's a word emerging?
Yes, it's the last word of the second line, I think, of this German hymnal. I'm not quite sure. Looks like a W-I-G, but perhaps we should look it up in Michael Levy's catalogue.
Michael Levy, a former director of the gallery, wrote the catalogue in which all the objects in the ambassadors are identified and described.
Yes, here we are. On the right-hand page, Ewiglich. These hymns actually are Luther's renderings, and on the left is the first verse of his version of the Veni Creator Spiritus, and on the right, the beginning of his 10 Commandments.
So you're working on the 10 Commandments?
Working on the 10 Commandments, which seem to be rather damaged and tail off into nothing.
While Martin Wilde approaches his work with scholarly detachment, outsiders sometimes get very heated about what they believe he does to old master paintings. A house in North London is the UK headquarters of Artwatch International, a lobby group which has drawn up a Bill of Rights for works of art. Michael Daly is their director and a tireless critic of the National Gallery's approach to conservation.
National Gallery's methods, even as museum and gallery techniques go, are probably the most intrusive in the world. They don't seem to like old paintings, even though the paintings are old. They like them to look as much like they believe they would have looked when they were painted. And that is not only dangerous in terms of restoration technique, it's also artistically controversial, because in fact they're attempting to achieve something that isn't realizable. Paintings don't look, even when they're cleaned totally, they don't look as they did when they were new.
Of course, we know that pictures change over the centuries. Some are damaged, some suffer paint loss, and in some, the pigments themselves change colour. But on the whole, the gallery policy is to show the paint put on by the artist as it now is, if we can. Reynolds' portrait of the Countess of Albemarle, for instance, was cleaned in 1959. What you can now see is a woman who is apparently suffering from galloping anemia. In fact, all Reynolds' paint on her cheeks is there. It's simply that the pink pigment has faded and she now looks pale. The gallery policy is to leave the original artist's paint, where possible, as it stands. And so we don't add our paint over Reynolds' paint, rouging her up to give her back her complexion, but we let her appear as she now is and explain what's happened.
Some pictures have faded, others emerge looking surprisingly bright.
It's a frightful thing to say, but I think the Holbein should be kept away from
Art critic Brian Sewell has for some time had his doubts about the National Gallery's restoration policy. When Titian's Bacchus and Ariadne was restored in the 1960s, Sewell was one of a number of people who thought that it had suffered from over-cleaning.
What do you now feel about it? Why was there such a fuss? And what do you now feel about it?
If you look at the sky, which seemed to most of us 30 years ago, and still, to be far too bright, that it leaps forward.
Yes, I mean, clearly the blue is the blue Titian put on. We know lapis is very stable, it was that bright. Surely what has happened, we know that the green leaves on the tree above Bacchus, they have discoloured with light. The pink of his cloak, the lake, has faded. Now, if those were brighter and stronger, they would, of course, push the sky back, wouldn't they?
But can you explain to me where I think the restoration has fudged it, which is in a wide band across here, where it seems that he has recognized that he cannot take away what I'm sure he wanted to take away, which is a lot of this brown fudge underneath. Simply didn't know how to deal with it. It isn't shadow. That is not the way the light is falling. Which is what I mean about over-cleaning up there and under-cleaning down here.
Yes, I would disagree with both points. That you'll be surprised to learn. To start with up there, as you know, this is painted on a gypsum on very thin canvas. It was rolled up like a carpet in the late 16th century, face out. But it meant that there were lots and lots of little losses all over the sky. Where the gypsum had flaked. What we're looking at is actually a sky that had to be restored because the gypsum was going to fall off completely in the 1960s. And the difficult thing has been putting in the little losses. And I think it's because of the way that's been done that the sky now does look rather flat. It's not, I don't think it's a cleaning problem, but a retouching problem.
There are those who would still maintain that original material must have been removed, and that the picture would also have undergone a process known as leaching. They claim that solvents used in cleaning leach paint, that is, draw out plasticizing elements, leaving the paint brittle.
The problem of leaching was first recognised in 1917, and in the 1960s, the director of the National Gallery said he admitted that it was a problem, that it wasn't known fully what the effect of leaching was, and that the gallery's scientists would carry out research into the subject. But I haven't been able to find out from the gallery whether this research was ever carried out.
Experiments quoted by Michael Daly were done on paint less than 50 years old. The National Gallery has just recently done tests for leaching on old masters, including the ambassadors.
This is an example of some of the bluish-green paint from the celestial globe, and is a mixture of azurite and lead white. And what we have here are, in fact, two samples, one taken following mechanical removal of the varnish with a scalpel. And we're comparing that with a sample taken from an area which has been cleaned with propan-2-ol. And there's very little difference between the two samples. There's little evidence of any selective removal of these low molecular weight fragments between the mechanically cleaned sample and the solvent cleaned sample.
So there's been no leaching?
Certainly no evidence of leaching in this case, nor indeed from samples elsewhere within the painting. This type of study, I think, is far more meaningful than the rather artificial studies which have been conducted on juvenile paint films, which may be only a few decades old and would be expected to be very vulnerable to solvents.
January 1994. The picture is now cleaned. The exposed joins in the panels are all visible, and there are some quite large areas of loss on the left-hand side of the painting, probably caused by damp. But the National Gallery team are undismayed. Indeed, are delighted that so much of Holbein's original paint has survived.
What I find astonishing is that so much of the picture is absolutely intact. If you look particularly at the right-hand side, really the only losses that you've got virtually are down these cracks where the separate panels are joined together. But it's very, very exciting actually just to see these large, large areas of Holbein's original paint with hardly anything damaged at all. But there are some really wonderful things that have been uncovered on Jean de Dinteville's dress, almost, skirt here. There's a sort of decoration round the edges in 2 tiers. You can see there are little sort of furry edges and little light grey highlights picking out the edges there. And then there are tiny details coming out. When we got down to his foot, to the toe there, you can see the slashing in the toe here. These tiny slashes were, I think, very important for Tudor costume. And then there are some wonderful little slashes into the edge of this beautiful pink sleeve there. I don't know quite how this is done. You can't see any stitches. It looks as if something's just kind of slipped into the edge of his sleeve there.
The next few months will be devoted to a series of examinations and treatments before retouching begins. First, there will be blister laying, which means gluing down loose paint. There is also the question of whether to replace the wooden back or cradle put on by gallery restorers in the 1890s.
It just seems rather unnecessary to remove it, just to replace it with something else when this is proven to be quite satisfactory.
What I think is very clear is that looking at the gaps in a picture, there are a number of ways you can decide how you make them good. The Italians have traditionally gone, particularly with older paintings, for a system that involves touching in related colours, like this head of the Cimabue Christ, where you can see that they haven't attempted to reconstruct the head, partly because the losses are too big. They've simply touched in with little strokes of related colour. It's a way of coming at it that obviously comes from working on large frescoes on walls, where great parts of the fresco are lost, you can't reconstruct them, and you simply tone in an undistracting way. Another detail here, you can see close up, here's an arm with a loss running right across it that's been touched in different colours, with the effect that one critic has described as Harris tweed. And I think actually is more distracting than attempting to reconstruct. You can, for instance, if you have pictures like these 2 German saints, the landscapes in which these 2 saints are sitting are almost entirely 19th century inventions. And when we began working on the pictures, it was clear that there was very little authentic landscape at all. But the figures remained pretty legible. So after conservation, we decided to leave them like this, rather than to attempt to reconstruct a landscape. So this seems to us the best sort of compromise. In the Holbein, the level of finish in the great majority of the picture is very, very high. Holbein's technique was so excellent, and the level of conservation within the planks, on the whole, so good, that I think it demands quite a high level of finish and reconstruction. To leave areas blank or to touch them in little coloured strokes would, I think, be terrifically distracting and would make it almost impossible to enjoy the really well-preserved bits of Holbein himself.
I've been retouching the losses for 8 or 9 months now, since last summer. And I started at the bottom of the picture, where the largest losses were probably because of water running down either the back or the front. And the reason it looks like this now is that when a restorer is faced with quite a damaged area of a picture, you tend to restore the easiest parts first to reduce the eventual problem to the minimum possible. I'm doing the main layer of retouching in paraloid B72 and powder pigments. Paraloid's a basic form of acrylic and has a very long life without changing colour, and it's permanently reversible. The bit where the nose bone is almost entirely missing is rather more complicated. For the moment, I'm just leaving that while my colleague David Saunders is working out some anamorphic projections of other skulls to get a view of what the nose bone might be like.
Next steps.
The scientific department has done a perspective animation on Holbein's skull and also photographed a model skull to compare the two. Not only do the shadows differ, but more importantly, the reconstruction of the nose bone is not quite correct.
Panel joints across a lot of the nose here.
Brian Sewell has been following events from the beginning. This is his third visit to the conservation studio.
You've had a real problem with the problem, haven't you?
Yes, I have, yes. I had several real problems with them. Quite a lot of places.
Yes. I'm enormously encouraged. The last time I came, I thought, well, I went away thinking, oh Lord. But it's beginning to pull together. The difficulties are perfectly obvious. I mean, they were obvious when the picture was stripped. It's the blacks, which are always very difficult to measure and always extremely difficult to put any kind of modelling in once the modelling is destroyed. And of course the skull, which is the kind of miraculous thing, which always seemed to read perfectly well when throughout my lifetime.
With the skull, there is quite a serious problem. Looking at the previous reconstruction, the nose bone is in fact quite wrong. This should not be a sort of upside down V.
But surely the ethics of the case are that you restore Holbein's errors and not.
Well, the nose bone fell out in France in the 17th or 18th century, and this one I'm pretty certain is by my predecessor here in 1891. And there was the remains of another one underneath it. So.
Yes, well, I see the problem is more complicated than I thought.
I'm using the summer for the blacks because it's the only time of year you can really see them when the sun's out in the middle of the day for a few hours. And the retouchings I did earlier in the year, on the whole, are a little bit too cool, and it's now possible to see what colour and tone they really should be. And the retouched losses look a little bit dark, which is partly because they're slightly smoother than the surrounding paint, which is particularly badly cracked here, so that scatters the light. So I can cheat slightly by putting a few slightly greyish-brown spots on the bits that are too dark, which will have the same effect as the cracks, I hope.
As the restoration progresses, research continues into all aspects of the painting. Martin Wilde and Susan Foister have been consulting experts from the start. Even at this late stage, it's possible for them to be surprised.
Well, if you follow this cording chenille trimming up here, it suddenly disappears, and quite clearly there is damage there. We have what appears to be a continuation of the chenille edge here, which you must imagine coming down on the other side. Now, that kind of disturbance to the fall of these very organised folds that look almost like church organ pipes, in effect, is usually caused by the presence of a codpiece, which would just fit in that area. And I could give you a whole list of paintings with codpieces.
So it was a French fashion as well as an English one, because the portraits of Henry VIII obviously will show him wearing a codpiece in quite a similar costume to this.
Yes, that's right. Next door in the portrait gallery, you've got the Whitehall cartoon where he's very clearly wearing a codpiece. I just wonder if somebody got a bit prudish at some point in the history of the painting and decided it was better removed. So that's the X-ray.
That's the X-ray. If I fit that over there, you see this shape here, which is quite irregular, is complete paint loss, and that's, well, you can see roughly where that is there.
It's an intriguing suggestion, but they won't be inventing a codpiece without more clues as to its design. The nosebone, however, is another matter. This is the toughest part of the restoration, and Martin Wilde has been leaving it till almost last.
Just looking at it again, it's a little bit hard to see how it does all fit together, which is why I'm going to do some minor bits around the sides. The way restorers go about these things is not to take a broad view and start painting great chunks of skull. The whole idea is to avoid making any decisions at all until the last possible moment, which you do by finding a little bit where it's obvious what's missing and putting that back, and then another little bit, and another little bit, like a jigsaw. And you hope that in the end, the bits that now look very daunting, in fact fall quite neatly into place without any inventive decisions being made at all. What I'm doing now is putting in some of the cracks and distressing and so on. If you look at the skull, at the bits that are well preserved rather than the bits that are completely missing, which I'm actually working on, there are quite a number of different sorts of textures. There are cracks in it. And there are also signs of Holbein's brushstrokes where the paint's thinner and forms ridges. And I've got to put in something roughly equivalent to that on the bits that I've just reconstructed, or they'll look much too new and bright.
The gallery's framing department has made a new frame for the ambassadors, based on a 16th century Flemish model. The next consideration is how to present the painting to the public. There are questions of space, lighting, height, and whether it should hang on or in front of the wall.
Could we think of actually having it effectively where it is, on a freestanding
You could case it for skull freaks and people want to look at it, which are really two quite different things, I think.
But each perfectly proper. I mean,
Yes.
everybody does want to see the skull coming into true by going to the side, and everyone does want to look closely at the shelf.
Can we look at it slightly higher? I mean, if you slowly take it up, we can tell you when to stop. Go through here.
Because it's going to be.
Let's see if they.
It's going to be seen from such a long way away. Actually.
I think the further off you push it, the more logical it is to see it high. When you push it that long.
Yes. And certainly from a distance, it's like smart.
Yes, it's even slightly lower than the Garofalo,
Yes.
isn't it, where it is?
But from here, even with a crowd, it would be immediately recognisable.
Someone to walk in front of it.
Yes, could we get someone to walk in front? Can we get some of the picture handlers
Well, the doors
to
are
walk in
normally
front?
shut as well.
Yes,
so-
exactly.
The gallery has invited 2 international experts to comment on the restoration. Johan Vadum is chief restorer at the Moritz House in Holland. And Giorgio Bonsanti is head of the second largest restoration institute in Italy.
Remember, before restoration, really, for instance, here in the dark gown, one didn't absolutely see the folds and the plasticism of the forms. It was quite an even surface, flat, absolutely flat.
The subtle way that it's made with the small hairs here, which would be the first ones to go if they would be talking about an over-cleaning or things like this. These small hairs are all beautifully preserved, and you have it also on the cuffs, very delicately. Each little brush stroke is visible and very distinct still. It looks just so marvelous the way it, after all, has been preserved. I can be fully approving of the treatment as it's been carried out here. It looks very much like what we would have done in the Moritz House.
And concerning myself, I hope we would have been able to achieve the same splendid result as Martin Wilde did, which is, in my opinion, really very, very good. And now I'm happy that the restoration has done justice to this work.
To me, it is as perfect as could be. Clearly, there is a different philosophy at work now. So the future is secure, perhaps.
It's just fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
Magnificent. I mean, it shows you what Holbein was actually doing.
I just think the close-up is just stunning.
They've deliberately done that, haven't they, for you to notice it?
It's very vivid and colours are lovely.